Today I want to share with you an easy, all-in-one blender pumpkin cake, perfect for your Thanksgiving dessert table. And you can use fresh pumpkin or canned pumpkin. Hi sweet friends, my name is Mary from marysnest.com and I'm author of the Modern Pioneer Cookbook, and I'd like to welcome you to my kitchen. Now if you want to use canned pumpkin to make this cake, be sure to check the timestamps below so you can skip over where we prepare the fresh pumpkin. And you don't need to write anything down. There'll be a link in the description below that'll take you over to my website where you can print out the recipe or read it online. To prepare the pumpkin, the first thing you're going to want to do is get a baking sheet and line it with some parchment paper. If you don't have parchment paper, you can certainly use aluminum foil. It does just make the cleanup easier. If you don't have either, you can put it right on the baking sheet. Once we cut up this pumpkin, we're going to roast it in the oven. So you want to go ahead and set your oven, preheat your oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And the only other thing that you're going to need is a little bit of olive oil. Now what I've got here is commonly known as a Cinderella pumpkin. But if you don't have this type of pumpkin, you can also use any baking pumpkin. I really like this type of pumpkin. You may also know it as a Rouge Vif d'étain pumpkin. It's a French pumpkin, although this particular variety was grown here in the United States. But they're all based on the heirloom French pumpkin. And the flavor is absolutely delicious. And if you've not tried the pumpkin soup that I made last year with a Cinderella pumpkin, I highly recommend it. And I'll be sure to link to that in the description below. Now what you're going to need to prepare this pumpkin is a good sharp knife and then a vegetable peeler. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut this pumpkin in half, actually a little off half, it's a little off center because we've got this stem in the middle that we're working around. Now that we've got the pumpkin cut in half, we're going to clean out the inside. A nice big spoon like this can work very well, and if there are any areas that are a little more difficult to get something out of, to get some of this out of, a grapefruit spoon with a serrated edge works very well. Now once you get all the pulp cleaned out, you can certainly save the seeds and roast them later. Next, all you have to do is get a vegetable peeler and remove the skin from the outside of this pumpkin. Now, the good news is this type of pumpkin has a very thin skin and it's relatively easy to get this job done quickly. Just use your vegetable peeler and just come right across like this. As you're using your peeler to remove the skin from your pumpkin, if you run into any little divots that you can't quite get the peeler down into, a paring knife will work perfectly. Now that we've got both pumpkin halves cleaned up and I've also removed the blossom end and the stem end, we're going to cut these into 1-inch pieces. Now don't worry, it's not an exact science, so if they're not exactly 1 inch, it's nothing to worry about. And as you cut up the pumpkin, you're just going to want to go ahead and transfer it to your baking sheet. Now I sliced my half into half, so I had 4 pieces of pumpkin to make it easier to cut up into pieces. And if you're using a Cinderella pumpkin, you will probably find that you can fit about 1/4 of the pumpkin cubes onto a baking sheet. If you have multiple baking sheets, you can certainly put multiple baking sheets into your oven filled with the cut up pumpkin. If you only have 1 baking sheet, you can certainly do it in individual batches. Now I'm just going to drizzle a little bit of olive oil on the pumpkin cubes, and then I'm going to toss it with clean hands. And the reason that I'm doing this is because it'll just help everything roast a little better, and it doesn't affect the puree that we're going to turn this into when we make the cake. But I'm not going to season this in any way. And the reason that I'm not seasoning it is because I'm going to be using the puree to make a cake. But if you were just tossing this to roast and serve as some roasted pumpkin, you could certainly put some salt and pepper, some herbs, it'd be wonderful. But I like to roast the whole thing. I'm going to roast all of it just with a little bit of olive oil and leave it plain so that it gives me a lot of options as to what I want to do with it. Also too, something that I find really flavorful about roasting this with just a touch of olive oil, it gives the cake a wonderful flavor because the roasting really brings out a richness of the pumpkin as opposed to just boiling it. But boiling it is certainly an option, but if you do that, make sure that when you puree it, if it has taken on any water, you want to let the puree drain a bit so that you're using a nice dense puree and not one that's watery. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in our 400-degree oven, our preheated 400-degree Fahrenheit oven, and I'm going to let this roast maybe 20 to 30 minutes, somewhere in that range. I want to start checking it at 20 minutes because you don't want it to get brown, you just want it to become soft. But everybody's oven is a little different. That's why I give kind of this 20 to 30 minute range. But start checking it at about 20 minutes. Well, my pumpkin roasted for approximately 25 minutes at that 400-degree Fahrenheit temperature. And how I tested that it was done, I just took the point of a sharp knife and made sure that I could easily pierce the pumpkin pieces. Now for the pumpkin cake recipe, we're going to need 1 cup of pumpkin puree. So all I'm going to do is take my potato masher and start mashing my pumpkin, and then I'll measure out 1 cup. Now you can certainly use a blender or a food processor, whatever you want, to puree your pumpkin cubes, but I find since I do have this handheld potato masher, it works very well. So all we're going to do now is measure out our 1 cup of pumpkin, and then we're going to go over all the other ingredients we're going to need. For this all-in-one blender pumpkin cake, we're going to need 1 cup of pumpkin puree. You're also going to need a half a cup of honey or 6 tablespoons of maple syrup. And any maple syrup will do, grade A or grade B, although I think they all call it grade A now, just light or dark, but either will work. Then you're going to need 3 large eggs and 6 tablespoons of butter, unsalted, that you've melted and cooled. Then you're going to need a 1/4 cup of sour cream or a 1/4 cup of plain whole milk yogurt. Whole milk yogurt may also be labeled full-fat yogurt. It's basically yogurt that's been made with whole milk, milk that has all of the fat intact. Next, you're going to need a teaspoon of vanilla extract, and any type of vanilla extract will do. Today at the grocery store, you may notice there are many varieties of vanilla extract with slightly different flavors, and they come from different parts of the world, but any will do. This is simply a homemade vanilla extract, and I'll be sure to link to the video as well as the recipe in the description below if you'd like to make your own homemade vanilla extract. For this recipe, I'm using all-purpose spelt flour. It may also be labeled white spelt flour if you're shopping for this at your grocery store. If you're using the modern version of all-purpose flour that's commonly sold at most grocery stores, the recipe wouldn't need to be adjusted in terms of the fat, and I will have that information in the detailed recipe. The ancient grains like einkorn, emmer, and spelt absorb fat differently than the modern day wheat. Whether in their whole grain form or their all-purpose form, they still absorb fat differently than modern day all-purpose flour. So we're using less fat for this particular cake than we would be if we were just using the standard all-purpose flour sold at most grocery stores. Now, if you have whole grain einkorn, emmer, or spelt, which in their whole grain form are referred to as berries, if you have einkorn, emmer, or spelt berries and you want to grind those into flour, and then you want to create your own all-purpose version of those by sifting out the bran and the germ, I have a very detailed video where I show you how to do that, and I'll be sure to link to that in the description below. Now, the remaining ingredients that you're going to need are 1 teaspoon of ground cinnamon and a 1/4 teaspoon of freshly grated nutmeg. Now, certainly if you have nutmeg that's ground, you can use that. I just really find that if you use the freshly grated nutmeg, the flavor really pops. It tastes so beautiful in any type of baked good if it's freshly grated. Next, you're going to need a 1/4 teaspoon of ground ginger, sometimes referred to as powdered ginger. You're also going to need a 1/4 teaspoon of fine ground salt. I'm just using a sea salt, but you just want to make sure you use a fine ground salt. And then you're going to need a teaspoon of baking powder and a half a teaspoon of baking soda. Now what we're going to do is put all the wet ingredients into the blender. So I'm going to go ahead and dump in my pumpkin puree. Now I'm going to go ahead and put in my maple syrup. I really like maple syrup in this. I've got to put in 6 tablespoons. That's 2 and then 6. And I like the maple syrup in here because I think it gives a wonderful flavor. But by all means, you can use honey. Now I am using the dark maple syrup again because I love the flavor. But you can use the light as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and add in the eggs. I like to break them into a little ramekin rather than breaking them directly into my blender, just in case I got a bad one. It's rare, but it can happen. So we'll go ahead and put in our 1 egg. And now I'll get the other 2. Now we're going to go ahead and add in our melted butter and our sour cream. And I just want to mention that if you were roasting the pumpkin with me and not using canned pumpkin, you will want to lower your oven temperature now down to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you're just starting at this point, you'll want to preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Now my butter is melted and cooled, so that won't cook the eggs. So we'll get that in there. And now we'll go ahead and put in our sour cream. And now the last of the wet ingredients, the 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. Now we're going to go ahead and blend this until it's smooth. It shouldn't take more than 30 to 60 seconds. Now I'm just going to put a small mesh strainer over the top of my blender and put my ingredients, my dry ingredients in that way. If you want, you can also just mix them in a bowl, whisk them, and put them into your blender. Now before we add in the dry ingredients, I just want to mention that you can bake this cake in a variety of pans. You can use a standard cake pan, it's usually about 9 inches. You can use a springform pan, sometimes they're between 9 inches and 10 inches. You can use an 8x8 or a 9x9 square baking pan. You can even use a tube pan, which was my mother's favorite because that way she never had to worry about whether or not the center was baked thoroughly. The only variation will be on exactly how long it'll take to bake, and I'll share all of that with you in the recipe. Obviously, the deeper the amount of batter in your cake pan, the longer it's going to take to bake. So if you do use a 9-inch cake pan, then it's probably going to take a little longer than what I'm going to use. I've got a springform pan here. It's just a little bigger than a cake pan, standard cake pan. It's not quite 10 inches, but it's a little more than 9 inches. Now you can just do the simple dip and scoop for your flour, nothing fancy required. And we're going to need 1.5 cups. And again, this is my all-purpose spelt flour. Okay, I've got the cinnamon in there, and now I am just grating in my fresh nutmeg, kind of just estimating 1/4 teaspoon. Now I'm going to put in 1/4 teaspoon of ginger, and I forgot to mention earlier, you also want to include 1/4 teaspoon of cloves. So I've got that right in there. And if you have, what do they call it, pumpkin pie spice, you could certainly use that as well. Now I've got a teaspoon of baking powder, and we'll go with 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda. Perfect. And then 1/4 teaspoon of a fine ground salt. I'm just using a fine ground sea salt. And whatever type of pan you're using, you're going to want to go ahead and grease it with some butter. Alrighty, well I've got all of my flour and spices worked down into there. And now we're just going to give this a very quick whirl just to incorporate the dry ingredients. Alrighty, here we go. Well, this took about 60 seconds. Halfway through, I stopped it and just used this little spatula to kind of push down the sides a little, and it looks great. Now I'm just going to go ahead and pour the batter right into my pan. Now I'm going to go ahead and put this into my preheated oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is going to take somewhere between 30 to 35 minutes to bake. Well, I had this in my oven just about 30 minutes, checked it with a toothpick, it looked good, so I took it out to let it cool. Now, when you bake this, whether you do it in a springform pan or a cake pan or a square pan, whatever the case may be, you're going to see that it's going to dome up on top, and that's perfectly fine. Well, I've let this cool in the pan for about 10 minutes. Now I'm going to release the springform and remove the cake. It's still quite warm, so I'm just going to let it continue to cool, and then we'll slice it. Now, one thing that I do like to do is something my mom always did, and that was sprinkle her cakes with powdered sugar. So I'm definitely going to do that before serving it. I put the pumpkin cake on a pedestal, and then I surrounded it underneath with parchment paper because I'm going to sprinkle it with powdered sugar, and the parchment paper will then be removed, and it'll keep the cake stand nice and neat and clean. And depending how old you are, you might recognize this cake stand as something that came from the green stamp store. My mother would collect the green stamps in her little green stamp booklet, and then she and I would go to the green stamp store together and pick out different things. And she loved this cake stand, and she also got a basket also made out of this same white porcelain. I think it's actually called milk glass, is it? You'll have to correct me on that down in the comments, exactly what these type cake stands and the baskets that were made for holding fruit and other, decorative items and whatnot. And there was a whole variety of pieces that you could buy. I think it was called milk glass. What's especially nice about these blender cakes, and if you've made others, you might have experienced this also, that they do dome at the top. And what's nice is that the edges are lower, obviously, than the domed top, and they're wonderful for catching the powdered sugar if you like to sprinkle these with powdered sugar. Also, if you use a little, like I think sometimes it's referred to as like a water icing, where you take some of the powdered sugar. Some of you may know this as confectioner's sugar or icing sugar, and you mix it with a little water, and then you can kind of do a drizzle on top of this cake, and it's nice because it'll pool in the ends that are not domed. But I'm going to do powdered sugar in honor of my mom, because that's what she would have done. Now that I've got the whole cake dusted with powdered sugar, and you can certainly do a light dusting. I'm very generous with it, just like my mom always was. Now all I'm going to do is carefully pull out these pieces of parchment paper so I can keep my cake stand nice and neat. It's funny with the way these blender cakes tend to dome in the middle and then be recessed around the edges. Reminds me, you're going to laugh when I say this, but it reminds me a little almost like mountains, like the Alps. And I think I've shared this with you in the past. My mother was of Northern Italian heritage, and her family lived not too far from the Swiss border. So when we visited, we'd drive over into Switzerland. And so with my mom making these blender cakes and then dusting them with powdered sugar, I feel is a little reminiscent of the Alpine region that her family was very familiar with. Well, let's cut this cake and see how the texture came inside. Oh, it cuts beautifully. And then we'll give it a taste. And now for the taste test. The texture looks very light. It's light, yet moist. This is really delicious, and I think you're going to so enjoy this for your Thanksgiving dessert table. Now, if you'd like more recipes with pumpkin, including a pumpkin pie with a no-roll crust, and a full Thanksgiving menu from appetizers to dessert, be sure to click on this video over here where I have the whole playlist curated for you. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.